Don't let a DUI charge ruin your life. Get a professional and confidential evaluation from our experienced team at True Heights Treatment. Our evaluations are accepted by the majority of courts in the state of Illinois and provide a comprehensive assessment of your substance use patterns and potential treatment needs. Get the help you need today and start your path to a brighter future. Contact us now to schedule your evaluation at 708-248-7039 or at thtdui.com.
The George Brassey Podcast is made possible with funding provided from Brassey Global Strategies, LLC, a leading political consulting, public policy, government affairs, and research firm. Are you interested in running for elected office? Need advice? Call or email George 708-769-5015. Brassey Global Strategies 1 at gmail.com.
It's great to welcome Mike Pankow, the host of the Windy City Slam podcast, to the George Brassey Podcast. Mike, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, George. Thanks for having me.
Mike, tell the audience a little bit about who you are and a little bit about your podcast.
Well, professionally, I am a longtime journalist and a longtime wrestling fan. I started WindyCitySlam.com, which is a website focused on Chicago wrestling as well as wrestling around the world, like your WWE, AEW, et cetera, et cetera. But then around 2020, a friend of mine contacted me and he said, Mike, why don't you try a podcast for wrestling and maybe talk about the local scene and kind of make it hyper local? And I was like, okay. So I kind of went on his show a little bit the year prior to kind of, be a guest on his show and just talk a little bit about local wrestling and like 5 to 10 minute segments over a series of shows. And then we would talk like WWE pay-per-views and stuff like that. And then Windy City Slam just kind of caught on. We decided to do a separate podcast in January of 2020. We had moderate success with it. I was very excited of how it turned out. Unfortunately, the pandemic hit, so we kind of hit a little bit of a speed bump getting listeners and reporting on local news, since shows were, for the most part, shut down. But as the pandemic kind of waned a bit, we got a little traction. I actually broke off from my partner about May of last year and went on my own. So it was definitely a learning experience. But having local Chicago wrestling guests, Chicago legends, and even some people who used to wrestle in WWE, really, really cool. I go back to being a wrestling fan all the way back to when I was like 8 or 9 years old. This was the mid 80s where Hulk Hogan was getting big. The Von Erichs down in Texas were huge. The NWA with Ric Flair and the Four Horsemen and Dusty Rhodes. The AWA was just starting out on ESPN. And then all the WWF stuff with WrestleMania and Saturday Night's Main Event, Hulk Hogan versus Andre the Giant. So at that very point, that kind of got me hooked.
Mike, when you decided to become a journalist, did you think you would become a journalist covering wrestling, or did you think you would be covering other things or the news in general?
Well, I was always a sports fan, so I wanted to get into sports journalism, and that's kind of what I did. I'm an editor for a major publication company in Chicago, and I figured that would be the type of job I'd have. But professional wrestling was always a love of mine, so I'm like, at some point, I would like to integrate that a little bit. And in fact, I did cover a few items for professional wrestling back in the day, maybe 20 or so years ago. But now, going back maybe, about 4 years or so ago, yeah, because Windy City Slam, the website started in August of 2018. And I was kind of planting the seeds earlier that year, so probably about 4 years ago or so. And I'm like, I got to have a little bit more fun with journalism and writing and stuff like that. So I'm like, I'm going to create my own website and see if I can get it off the ground. And sure enough, my first major story was an old friend of mine that I actually had kept contacts with from that one of my wrestling stories back 20 years prior. And his name is Christopher Nowinski, the head of the Sports Legacy Institute, who is delved deep into concussions in sports over the years, and he obviously suffered greatly from concussions, and it shortened his professional wrestling career in WWE. And he was really cool. The website got off the ground then, and I just wanted to have more fun in my field. It kind of gotten a little monotonous, a little stressful in real life, but Windy City Slam and wrestling have really kind of reinvigorated me.
I think that's a great point. A lot of wrestling fans look at wrestling as a bit of an escape from the grind of the daily life. I know. Mike, you said Chris Nowinski, and can you talk a little bit about how you became friends with him? I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was basically it was a story idea for for my job that I was at. 2002. We had a staff meeting, and my boss was looking for pitches for story ideas, and Chris was at the time just coming off of Tough Enough, where he was a runner-up, and he was just starting out in WWE as a wrestler. And I did a little research and kind of looked some stuff up, found out he was a scholar athlete at Hersey High School. Really smart kid. He went to Harvard, obviously, which was part of his character. And now he's going into wrestling. He's like this big Harvard snob, this jock, this intellectual guy that was better than you. And it was an absolutely perfect idea for a story. And my boss gave me the green light. I dug into some things. I contacted WWE, got the interview with Chris, actually talked to Jim Ross as part of the story, which is really cool.
Wow.
Also tracked down his family. I got to talk to his parents and his sister. And it was a really cool story. And in fact, I even got to go to Monday Night Raw up in Milwaukee in September of 2002 to conduct the interview in person with Chris. So it was me, Chris, former WWE employee, Jonathan Coachman came and said hello during the interview, and former WWE employee Mark Carano was also there. I don't know if that's a name you've heard of. I mean, wrestling fans would probably know who he is because he worked in the office for like a long time. We were just talking, and Chris and I had the interview, and then I look down, I see Shawn Michaels and Triple H talking to each other. Mind you, this was about a week after their famous SummerSlam 2002 match where they just beat the hell out of each other. And now they're just sitting ringside talking like buddy. And then I see William Regal rolling around in the ring with Rosie and Jamal of 3 Minute Warning. It was quite the experience to see the behind the scenes stuff of WWE while I was doing this interview with Chris. And Chris and I, his family really enjoyed the story. Chris and I remained friends. We made contacts after that. And every so often we'd send messages. And then when I started Windy City Slam, I thought this was a great idea. This is a great first story to cover. It was the Sports Legacy Institute and the concussions, and then to catch up with Chris too. So it worked out perfectly.
Mike, do you feel like Chris's work really did have an impact on the WWE's product after he came out with the studies?
Absolutely. They changed some of their wellness stuff and their concussion protocols, eliminating chair shots and dangerous maneuvers like pile drivers and stuff like that. And I think they learned a lot from what Chris had to teach them after what Chris had learned through his own experiences. And I really think that a lot of professional wrestling has learned from what Chris has done over the years with the studies.
Professional wrestling has always been huge in the Chicagoland area. Talk a little bit about some memories you have growing up with professional wrestling in Chicago.
Yeah, I went to a couple of house shows in the early 90s. Plus, I did go to one independent show at the old Chicago Amphitheater down in like close to the lake. And that was quite the experience. It was Windy City Wrestling. I believe it was back in 1992. And there are still a couple of people that worked with that company that are still somewhat active today, whether it's wrestling or promoting or whatever. It kind of built a legacy of independent wrestling in Chicago. They actually had TV clearances for a while, which you never saw with independent wrestling. And now this particular show that I went to had a semi-main event of Ken Patera against Lanny Poffo, who was doing his genius gimmick, and Lanny's famous father, Angelo Poffo, was with him. And it was mostly independent guys you may have heard of a little bit later on. Trevor Blanchard, who competed briefly with WCW a few years later, he was on the show. It was Mad Max and Super Max. Frank the Tank Melson, who's actually recently promoted a show again in the Chicago area, a fundraiser, which was really cool. He was part of Iron Mike Sampson. And that's kind of got me a little bit into the Chicago scene. I mean, I didn't do a lot of independent shows after that until a few years ago when I started Windy City Slam, but I understood the passion of the scene. I heard things, and when the internet came along, it made it easier to follow independent wrestling too, because Facebook kind of promotes it, and there's websites and message boards, which some were toxic, but that's a story for another day. But yeah, Windy City Pro Wrestling kind of got me started on independent wrestling back in the day.
Do you still enjoy non-independent wrestling?
Oh, like WWE?
Yes, like the mainstream.
Absolutely. WWE, AEW, a little bit of Impact Wrestling, a little bit of Ring of Honor. MLW is a good show. The NWA with Chicago's own Billy Corgan promoting is really good. Yeah, so absolutely. From the big boys on down, I love it all.
Mike, what do you think about guys like Tommaso Ciampa or Mustafa Ali or Drew McIntyre, all who came through like AAW within the last 5 to 10 years, making it pretty big in the WWE?
All great talents. Drew McIntyre is an amazing fellow. And actually, a real quick story about me and Drew.
Sure.
My wife and I went out to lunch at a Fridays in Rosemont. This was Labor Day of 2009. And we were going to do lunch, and then she was going to go back home, and I was going to go back to my place because we were still dating at that point. And we walk in, we see 4 WWE people sitting, waiting for a table. And one of those people was Drew McIntyre. So I'm kind of nudging my wife, my girlfriend at the time. No, not my fiance yet, because that hadn't happened, but that was about a month out. But I was nudging her and be like, those are WWE people. And I got so excited. I was trying to contain it. And then I kind of nicely went up to all of them, shook their hand, introduced myself, and they were very gracious. I asked for pictures. So it's basically the baby faces pose with the baby faces and the heels pose with the heels. So I have a picture with me, Drew McIntyre, and Abraham Washington at the time was part of the ECW brand. And Drew was this baby face guy, really nice kid. And even after we got our table, you could see him walking through the room. Even back then, he kind of just had that command of the room. He had that youthful exuberance and confidence that you kind of see more now in WWE. So that's my Drew McIntyre story. But to your point, for the AAW people who've come through and become big, yeah, Mustafa Ali, I just love what he does. He's a good guy. His recent sabbatical from WWE, he's come back home. He's actually worked with kids at the Freelance Wrestling Academy. You could see what kind of heart that man has. And I hope at some point he does return to the ring. And Ciampa is a guy I really enjoy too. Loved his work in NXT. Very excited to see where his future takes him as well, no matter where he ends up. And AAW, you mentioned, that's a company that they just have an all-star lineup of wrestlers over and over again every month. And they just celebrated their 18th anniversary. I mean, they've had Keith Lee, they've had Johnny Gargano. I mean, Eddie Kingston. The names are just endless with that company. So if you're looking for independent pro wrestling in Chicago, I would recommend Warrior Wrestling for sure. And then AAW is at the top of that list as well, along with the freelance organizations.
I'm glad you mentioned Warrior Wrestling, Mike. Can you talk a little bit about that promotion? A lot of people who may listen to this podcast, maybe from the city of Chicago Heights, and they may not really understand kind of the gravity and kind of big deal Warrior Wrestling is in the pro wrestling world, being affiliated with Marion Catholic High School. So can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, Steve Tortorello is the principal over at Marian Catholic High School and a huge wrestling fan and at one time aspiring wrestler. And he just wanted to do something a little different for fundraising for the school. So he decided to put on a wrestling show and they called it Warrior Wrestling. It was he and his buddy Eric Hamilton. They put it together. It was May 2018. It was a success. They had like meet and greets and they had several matches, fun show. And they brought it back for Warrior Wrestling 2, which was the day before or the day after. It was the day after the big All In show, which was Cody Rhodes and the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega and them throwing their own show in the Chicago area. But Warrior brought guys like Brian Cage and Rey Mysterio, DJ Z, Sammy Guevara, people like that, the Lucha Brothers. And these were big names. And they were, Warrior was drawing fans, making good money for their programs, for the students and for scholarships and stuff like that. And it was right there at Marian Catholic High School in the gym. But now they've grown so much since then. They've started going on the road to Midwestern venues like South Bend in Indianapolis, St. Louis, Grand Rapids. It's just exploded, the popularity with the internet and word of mouth, and even a little bit of Windy City Slam promotion. A little pat on the back there, little Barry Horowitz on my shoulder.
Don't break your arm patting yourself on the back.
You know, like Gorilla Monsoon used to say, about 18 inches away from somewhere else. But yeah, Warrior Wrestling, terrific outfit, great people that run it. And I've talked to many wrestlers who have been affiliated with it, and they just have nothing but glowing things to say about that company in terms of how they treat you, the meals at the shows, how they get transportation for the wrestlers and help them get hotel accommodations and things like that. So really, really cool company. And during the summer, I know they're going to be bringing back their Stadium Series, which they've kind of done the last couple of years with social distancing during the pandemic. Now it's probably going to be bigger than ever back at the high school at Marian Catholic in Chicago Heights. It'll be on the football field, which is really, really cool. And it's a great family experience as well with the VIP Fan Fests. It may be a little pricey, but for the value, you get to meet all these wrestlers during the VIP. It's incredible.
You can listen to an interview with Principal Steve Tortorello in the podcast archives as well from earlier last year. Mike, the other outfit you mentioned was Freelance Wrestling. Can you speak about that promotion as well?
Yeah, Freelance and Freelance Underground, they're kind of offshoots of each other. And these are promotions that have been running for the last several years in the Chicagoland area. And it's a really cool kind of deal what Freelance does, because they run their promotion, they run their shows in the city, like mostly Logan Square Auditorium and sometimes a couple of other smaller venues in the city proper. And it's a rabid fan base. It was originally conceived as like a one-off or a two-off show where the founder, Matt Nix, the father of Freelance, basically said, yeah, we're just going to throw this thing together and see how it goes. And then it kind of became a thing. I mean, people would come and have a drink and have a good time, maybe hang out at the bar and listen to music before or afterwards. And then it just kind of became a thing. I mean, wrestlers started to get reliable money from Freelance, and the show just kind of grew from there. And it's just kind of achieved this cult following over the last few years. And a lot of great Chicago wrestlers wrestle there even now. And Freelance Underground kind of was an offshoot of both Freelance Wrestling and Underground Wrestling. And they run mostly in the suburbs using most of the same talent, but there's some differences. They bring some other outside folks in. Recently, they had Alan Five Angels of the AEW Dark Order work one of their shows. And both of those promotions, really a lot of fun, a lot of great wrestling, and definitely a great value for fans looking for a night out with some good wrestling.
Mike, the last question we always ask on the podcast is, what are 2 books that have been important to you as a person, and why?
This may be a little unconventional, as it's been a while since I've actually read a book cover to cover. I'm more of a magazine or newspaper featurey type guy. I like to read long features and stories like that. But in terms of books, I got to go way back for my first one. Miracle on 35th Street, Winning Ugly with the 1983 White Sox. And this was by former Chicago Tribune reporter Bob Logan. And this was one of the first books that I actually had that wasn't a kid's book or a Peanuts book or a Garfield book. And I read this thing cover to cover a few times, and it really got me into the world of sports and eventually into the world of sports journalism. And it was just a fun read about the 1983 White Sox. It kind of came out of nowhere with this bunch of ragtag guys, some really good players. Tony La Russa was their manager. Where have you heard that name before? And they ended up winning the division, running away. But unfortunately, of course, at that point, they lost in the playoffs, and Chicago was known as a second city sports town at that point. But that book right there, I mean, I still have it. It's actually on my desk. It's actually still in decent shape. It's got some wear, but it's definitely, it was a very influential book on me. And then the second book I chose was Have a Nice Day by Mick Foley. Now, this is one of the first books that was penned by a pro wrestler. And it kind of took me inside the mind of a wrestler. And it made wrestling more of a personal connection to me reading that. And that's something that you kind of saw this, how they were on TV, but the wrestling biographies, starting with Foley's, really kind of opened the world up to us fans and kind of made them relatable human beings, and they're people too. And, we kind of understood what some of the trials and tribulations they went through as wrestlers.
Mike, thank you so much for coming on my podcast. If somebody wanted to learn more about you or connect with you or find you on the internet, where would they do that?
Yeah, you can try WindyCitySlam.com. That's my main website for Chicago professional wrestling. And I also do a little bit of WWE and AEW coverage as well. And then you can also catch me on social media, Mike Pankow, and then Windy City Slam on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I also have a Mike Pankow YouTube page where I have some of my wrestling interviews and some other things that I've done over the years with UIC basketball and WWE Slam Crate unboxings, goofy stuff like that. But basically, you can Google me. I'm one of the first hits for Mike Pankow, and Windy City Slam is just a passion project of mine. If you love professional wrestling in and around Chicago, please support Windy City Slam. I would really appreciate it.
I love the podcast myself, and I was glad to have my practice help sponsor it. It's a great listen.
Thank you for being a sponsor and being a friend, George.
Take care, Mike.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Help George stay on the Chicago Heights City Council. Go and donate today at tinyurl.com/AldermanGeorge 2023.
Begin to transform your life and work towards inner peace with expert psychotherapy. At True Heights Treatment, our experienced therapists provide personalized, compassionate care to help you overcome life's challenges and reach your goals. Whether you're struggling with depression, anxiety, relationship issues, or other mental health concerns, our team is here to support you. With a warm and welcoming in-person and virtual office atmosphere and a commitment to person-centered and evidence-based treatments, we are dedicated to helping you address your life's challenges. Contact us now to schedule your first session at 708-248-7039 or online at trueheightstx.com. Book your appointment today and start your journey towards a happier, healthier life.
Need more George? Like his pages on Facebook. Friends of George Brassey PAC, Fifth Ward Business Alliance, Chicago Heights Bicycle and Pedestrian Resource Center, and the George Brassey Podcast.